From this point on, we really need to think about our drawings as an arrangement of shapes on the page. We can't just think about drawing objects. We have to remember that even when we're concentrating on objects, we're drawing space. So there's a couple ways we can think about this. One is to take the viewfinder that you made for our negative space drawings. It's a 4 by 4 inch window. And we can make that larger to a 4 inch by 5 inch window. And we can use that to help us visualize how much of whatever we're looking at we want to be on our drawing, right? So in the two examples I've got shown here, you can see them doing that with a little homemade viewfinder. Of course, we can also do this with our phone and use the viewfinder on our phone. A 4 by 5 is proportionate to our 14 by 17 inch pad. So be mindful that if you use your phone, it may be a very different rectangle than the size of the page. I've got a number of excerpts from Bert Dobson's Keys to Drawing. And you see how he thinks about composition of one arrangement of forms that are on his work desk, really. It says, generally I drew the arrangements as I found them, but occasionally I shifted objects to make a better design. If something looked too confusing, I omitted it. If a space looked too blank, I moved something into it. My decisions were made almost unconsciously. I just played with the shapes until something clicked for me. So this is one arrangement of scissors and glue and paintbrushes and so on, just things that he has already kind of sitting around him on his work desk. Here's a couple other arrangements of those same things. I said, consider your eye level and distance from the subject. A drawing is a record of not only what you're looking at, but where you are in relation to what you're drawing. So it gives us a sense of perspective, in other words, where the artist is. If you take a look at the example on the left, you can see his dramatic overhead view, which creates more negative spaces. And then as he moves into the next example on the top right, it says everything is clustered towards the center in this arrangement, and only a touch of the dark background is showing. You can also see how it feels maybe a little more closed on the left side in terms of space, and it feels more open on the top, the right, and the bottom because things are being cropped out. There's also this kind of vertical arrangement primarily in the example on the left again, where not much is breaking the plane left and right of significance, and mostly it's an up and down kind of view. And if you look at the last example on the bottom right, you can see how he's moved in very close and how the subject becomes more abstract a bit, where negative space shapes are even more prominent in this case. So again, 4 examples of the same thing, but taken from very different vantage points, which would make very different drawings. So this is how we want to kind of think about whatever we're drawing now, is again, this arrangement of shapes, and that there are lots of possibilities with even one kind of simple subject. We want to think about the potential for what a drawing could look like as we use our viewfinder or our phone to help visualize that drawing space. Here's a couple of other examples where the picture plane changes based on the artist's perspective and where they are in relation to what they're looking at. So you can see on the top left, we have all of these items on the table at about eye level. And so it makes this kind of horizontal band with not much active negative space on the top and the bottom. As we raise up a bit and look at that from a slightly higher viewpoint, you can see things are still kind of clustered in the center, but we have more movement kind of up and down and at some diagonals, and the negative space starts to get more interesting. As you look at the bottom left, now we're even higher above the same group of objects. And it creates really this kind of vertical column that tends to divide the picture plane left and right a bit. And as we zoom in a bit on that in the bottom right, you can see how we've shifted our angle just a little bit, and now we have even more definable and interesting kind of negative space shapes. And there's this kind of circular movement throughout that picture plane. So as I said, again, we have to remember drawing is an arrangement of two-dimensional shapes in the picture plane. So the artist must see what they're drawing in those terms. Now here are two diagrams of that series of objects. And you can see what I was talking about in the third example, where we had a real vertical kind of column that divides the left half of the picture plane from the right half. It says, from this perspective, the arrangement is evenly spaced and monotonous. The picture plane is also divided in half by that vertical alignment of forms. So notice the shape of the cup and the other two cylinder objects, how they're all about the same size, how the rectangles on the left and the right, and then the plate with fruit on it on the right, and then the oval object on the left, it really creates this almost symmetrical arrangement. And it's kind of boring, right? The negative space is pretty boring. That's also a real telltale sign it's not as interesting as it could be visually. Comparing that to the right, just a subtle shift where now instead of having a vertical line, we have a diagonal line, and we have more overlapping of forms so that the plate on the right is overlapped a bit, the box on the left is overlapped a bit. It connects all these things together, and it creates more of a sense of movement. Now, one thing I've seen students do as we kind of talk about this is they immediately then start to clump everything together. And I'm not advocating that either. What I am advocating is really thinking about your subject as an arrangement of shapes within your rectangular picture plane. And think about the movement, right, through that picture plane. Think about how the eye moves from one area to another. If everything's all clumped up, again, it kind of does the same thing in terms of killing the negative space if we have something directly centered. We've talked about this in a previous video on negative space. So here are some other examples of arrangements of kind of simple objects. On the top left, you see how this linear alignment creates a movement from left or from right to left. Because we have this kind of shift in scale, it's almost like a triangular shape moving from one side of the picture plane to the other. And that arrangement certainly is creating relationships through scale. Now, rearranging those same things, you can see in the bottom right that we get an arrangement where some things are grouped together because they're overlapping, and then that is counterbalanced with the duck sculptural object on the right. It also creates this alignment that makes natural focal points. In one of the previous videos, a photographer was talking about the rule of thirds and how when they arrange forms, they think about those natural placements that hit in those kind of four quadrants that make up the rule of thirds. Basically, you're dividing your picture plane into thirds vertically and horizontally, and where they cross, they make natural focal points. And so that's what you see in the bottom left is a focal point based on the rule of thirds. Tangents can also happen as we start arranging forms. And a tangent is when a shape touches or aligns with another. And I've got some 4 humorous examples from Bert Dodson's Keys to Drawing again. It says, in the example on the top right, the woman's elbow, instead of resting on the ledge, seems to be leaning against the other woman's head. In the example on the bottom right, it says the tangent is at the point where the woman's nose appears to touch the window. Is the rectangular shape a window in the background, or some other object actually touching the woman's nose. These tangents become a distracting focus for our attention. So we've all seen these kind of things when we've taken photographs before, right? If we get certain alignments of things, it can make it look like maybe a tree is growing out of someone's head, or someone's arm is connected to another person's body in some way. So we want to think about these as, again, flat two-dimensional shapes, and then this idea of tangents starts to make more sense. In the matter of tangents, you'll want to consider the edge of your paper as one of the elements in your drawing too. Avoid letting the edge of any object end there or echo the edge by coming too close to it. So what I've done is I've taken a student drawing and I've intentionally made these tangents where the box on the left feels like it's leaning against the left edge of the picture. The object on the top right comes very, very close, and it kind of echoes that. It creates tension, in other words. Even the reflection of the wedge in the center, that kind of triangular-like shape, the reflection almost touches the bottom edge. And so what it tends to do is it makes the composition feel very closed off. And those areas become, as I said, points of tension. And by virtue of that, they become focal points. They are things that we notice, right? So how do we solve this in this case? We'd either give the objects more space so they don't come quite so close together or touch that edge, or we'd crop them out so the edge feels like it's going off the page. Either way relieves that tension. I've got a couple other examples. This was a photograph I took of arrangement of just 3 simple things in my kitchen. And you notice how the roll of toilet paper almost touches the box. And you can see it maybe a little bit more as I convert it to just black and white lines and shapes, and how it feels like it's resting on that edge almost. By simply shifting our vantage point or moving things around a bit, now I've got the 2 things overlapping, and that tension is no longer there. Another thing that happens here, of course, is it, in this particular case, creates more of a sense of depth. If I back up just for a second, you can see on the right version of this image how it feels more flat. And when we compare that to this version, now the eye moves back and forth in space. So we move around the surface, but we also move forward and back.